Derek, what can paleontology and the way of thinking of paleontologists bring to the discussion of race? Because the biology of race is a sensitive area, and we would like to ground it in some scientific thinking.
Yeah. Maybe I should preface this by saying, from a paleontological perspective, humans are just one species among the gazillions, for some paleontologists, humans might not even be that interesting. And of course, it's just with humans that questions about race and so on come up. But having said that, I do think that when you start looking at some research on human evolution and paleoanthropology, it's really difficult to avoid, certain questions about race kind of coming into play. And in particular, it's just hard to get around the fact historically that a lot of, if you go back to, say, 19th century science, a lot of the scientific interest in humans, and in particular questions about human origins and race, really did have, white supremacist motivations. And it's kind of, that historical scientific context is also kind of important to keep in mind.
In some cases motivations, in other cases just assumptions.
Assumptions.
And it's different than an affirmative motivation. It's just a predisposed bias, which may have cultural and may not be something that was that proactive, but it still could affect the science.
Sure.
So what follows from that?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think it's really interesting to look at, for example, some of the recent research on Neanderthals and Neanderthal human interactions and so on. This is a really active and interesting area of research in paleoanthropology, and lots of scientists in recent, I think people sometimes even talk a bit about the Neanderthal Renaissance. People are rethinking assumptions about Neanderthals and arguing
their cognitive capacity, the art, tools, various things.
And arguing that they might have been, in some ways, a lot more like us than we realize. And I think it's just quite an interesting thing to kind of look at that research with questions about race in mind. I think questions about race are never too far in the background in that work, in part because in some of the work on Neanderthals, scientists themselves sometimes in recent years have portrayed themselves as like pushing back against negative stereotypes about Neanderthals, which is kind of an interesting feature of
which has parallels with the history of racial approach, the scientific approach to race.
Sure.
And so this is another kind of motivation. It has a higher social good, but it is also a predisposition that does or does not necessarily make good science.
Right. Yeah. I think another thing going on here is when we're studying human evolution in particular, we're humans, so we have a lot at stake in kind of what sort of narrative the research is helping us craft about ourselves, and it's very hard to have the kind of detachment when thinking about human evolution that we might have if we're talking about some other say types of fossils from the deeper past.
And it's on both ends, because there'd be some people who would be reacting against a humanism, if you will, where we're at the top of the totem pole and everything else has to show coming up, and so people would be against that, and therefore look for evidence that supports an undermining of that theory.
Right.
So you have a lot of these tensions going on.
Right, definitely.